slightly strange request for all of you. It's going to be a little bit of audience participation at the start of this lecture. And I'll take you back to November last year, where I received an email from Hannah inviting me to give a plenary at this conference. And obviously I was very honoured, very excited. And then I noticed when that conference was taking place. And the date today is the 5th of April, and that is the date of my wife's birthday. And I said to her last November, how do you fancy spending your birthday in Antwerp? Now she's Dutch, so we've been to see her parents yesterday, and we're going to go out for a nice meal today. But I thought it would be really good if we, as a conference, could perhaps would that be alright? Yeah? So her name is Inga. She's sitting at the front here. She's wearing a lovely shade of red. So very briefly, I say thank you to my colleague Sabina, who's also a birthday today as well. So we'll have that later too. But if we could just sing happy birthday to her, and then I'll get on with the lecture. So, okay. So, 1, 2, 3.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Inga. Happy birthday to you. Three.
Thank you very much. Right, now on to the slightly more serious. Okay. So this is the plan for my lecture today. And I want to start off with a slightly controversial claim. I want to make the claim that actually nations are not really imagined communities. So Contra to that argument and that very famous book, we're much better off seeing nations as represented, as embodied, as practiced communities. That's a much more useful way of approaching and trying to understand the nation. Now, there's been some research which kind of demonstrates that in relation to what's been called hot and banal nationalism, and I'll briefly outline the media's role in relation to those two. But what I want to focus on today is what I've labelled as examples of ecstatic nationalism. These are kind of the national holidays and holy days, the large global sporting celebrations where nations come together. And what I want to try and do today is persuade you that these events, these examples of ecstatic nationalism, are also significant, and to focus on the role of the media. And one of the arguments I want to make is that they're not only significant for large numbers of people in a given nation who may participate in these events, but they are also significant in making the world as a world of nations knowable and represented and taken for granted. Okay, so that's my plan for today. And we're going to look at how these events are reported by the media. We look at the ways in which various groups participate in these events. And we try and think about the significance of these events to representing the world as a world of nations. And my final argument, which refers to this idea of flagging nations, is that actually when nations become slightly anxious about who belongs to them, these events may also become increasingly important. Okay, so that's the kind of outline for my lecture today. So, I know this is a bit controversial. I know you've probably all read this book, and maybe some of you have used that line about nations being imagined communities. And certainly, I think it's got something like 100,000 references So it's been pretty popular and pretty significant in the world of nationalism studies. But I think there's a fundamental problem in emphasizing processes of imagination. They may have some role to play in terms of enabling us to think of ourselves as part of a national community or as thinking of the world and providing them to nations. But I think there are far more important processes than the imagination. And here I draw on research primarily from anthropology, looking at ritual, and particularly an argument from Dayan Katz, which argues that solidarity is not produced by people thinking or imagining themselves as part of a nation. But solidarity is produced by people acting together. Solidarity is produced through social practices that may become saturated with emotions at a particular moment. Okay, so this is my kind of key theoretical argument at the start of this lecture, is that we need to move away from this idea of imagination, and we need instead to focus on practices and what people do and why they may be meaningful to certain things. So in other words, we're better off thinking of the nation as felt, seen, heard, embodied, in the case of the media, represented, materialized, and so on. So this is very much about activities and practices rather than people thinking and what goes on in it. Now, in terms of the literature on nationalism, I think we can evidence this argument by looking at work around hot and banal nationalism. And I'm not going to spend too much time here. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the work of McBillig. And I don't reference McBillig just as it comes from Loughborough. I think it's a really important book in nationalism studies, arguably the most important book that's come out in the last 30 years. And Billig's argument, as you probably know, is that yes, hot outbursts of nationalism are important. Unfortunately, we're witnessing one at the moment in the conflict in Ukraine. And the role of the media is vitally important in those hot outbursts of nationalism. But Billig argued that the nation and the idea of the nation and the idea of a world of nations is not only represented through these hot outbursts of nationalism, but we also need to focus our attention on the everyday and the way in which, for example, the media banally and routinely recreates the idea that we are part of a nation in a world of nation states. Now, if you think about the role of the media, I'll just say a couple of words about this. There's been some work done looking at the ways in which media reporting changes during conflict situations. So my colleague from the Nihal has done some interesting stuff on this, looking at the types of language that's used during these processes, how national symbols are foregrounded, how critical voices are excluded, how the media is micromanaged by governments during these conflict times. Looking at banal periods, Billig's work has inspired a whole variety of research which has probed the ways in which a variety of media outlets and media formats put forward this idea that we live in a world of nations, the use of language, we, here, our, us, the temporal cycles that we see in terms of when particular programs come out and published and so on. How the media provides a number of cultural reference points in terms of providing us examples of who is important in our particular society. And of course, Sabina spoke yesterday about how we are starting to see national frameworks and priorities articulated through the digital world as well. So in contrast to the argument from the 1990s that digital technologies were going to kind of supersede national boundaries, there's a lot of evidence to show that actually those national priorities and those national frameworks are being recreated online. However, in today's lecture, what I want to do is move beyond that hot banal dichotomy to focus on what I call ecstatic national events, or examples of ecstatic national events. Try and persuade you that actually these events are quite important. It might not happen that often, but they're quite important for a number of reasons. In terms of thinking about these events, I started off by looking at the literature on nationalism. And I was quite surprised to see that there isn't a huge amount written about these kind of national holidays and national holiness. So Billig, for example, dismisses them as conventional carnivals of surplus emotion. And many other people have criticized these events in generating dangerous emotion, not taking them seriously. And again, I've gone to anthropology and anthropologists. Here the work of Dayan Katz talking about the significance of public events to different communities. So communities requiring events where they can celebrate themselves, where they can view themselves, and this is really important, as if they constitute entities. Now this is a really important argument I'm going to make in relation to nations, as if the nation is something tangible, it is an entity that exists and that we have some relationship to. And again, my argument is that they're not only important, these events, for individual nations and many people within them, but they are important in the way that they represent nations within the global framework of nations with their own events and their own ways of celebrating. And one of the reasons they are important is that they tend to be associated with particular emotions. So in the case of a funeral of a national leader, maybe sadness and grief coming together for those reasons. But it can also be through celebration. When a particular nation wins a World Cup, for example, people get together and drink too much beer and wave flags and get very excited. And again, the nation in question becomes saturated with emotion. And the media's role in these processes is absolutely fundamental. I don't think that without the media, these events would not work in the contemporary era. So a starting point for thinking about some of these events and how to theorize them is Dayan Katz's work on media events. Now, they wrote this in the early 90s, and they were primarily talking about the importance of television in terms of TV's role in representing these events. And they identified a number of key factors. I've just noticed that I've spelled pre-planned. That should be pre-planned, not pre-planned. So these events are pre-planned. They are anticipated. They interrupt daily routines. They interrupt media schedules. They are broadcast live. They feature a live audience and a media audience. And Dayan Katz argued that they had an integrative function, that they drew people together so that they felt as if they were part of the national collectivity. Now, I've highlighted that characteristic because that is the one that's been criticised most of all by subsequent analysts. They have queried this idea that media events draw together everyone within a given community. You know, in complex societies with a range of ethnic groups, regional identities, genders, etc., there may be some people who are very strongly integrated as a result of these events, but there may be others who are highly critical or actively challenge the message of these events. So I think it's important that we take into account critics of this idea that by definition, media events integrate people. And there's some really interesting work again in critical communication, anthropology, that looks at the ways in which these mass rituals draw together some and exclude others.
Michael, could you turn the microphone to you because...
Oh, sorry. No, it's really... Okay. Oh, is that a bit better? Yes? Okay. Sorry about that. So drawing on the literature on media events, but also some of the critiques of this earlier work, I put together a definition of what I call ecstatic nationalism. Now, as you see, some of the key characteristics are taken from Dayan Katz's definition, but I've made the distinction between what the events are designed to do. So they are designed to bring together people by organisers or media organisations. But to think about, well, actually that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone within a given national society will participate actively in these events, and who participates, and who resists, and who ignores the event is an empirical question. Yeah, so we need to study each of those events and think carefully about who is being integrated and who is resisting and who is ignoring. When thinking about this idea of ecstatic nationalism, I'm also very much interested in the role of the media. Because I think, yes, Dayan Katz talked about the importance of television, but since the early 90s, the media landscape has dramatically changed. So we need to start to think about the ways in which digital technologies may be implicated in some of these events. And I'll talk about this in relation to a couple of examples as I move through the lecture. So in terms of, and here I'm kind of talking about the mainstream media, as I've said, these events tend to interrupt normal media schedules. So the media themselves are telling us that we are entering an important or a significant period because the normal programs are being altered in order to take into account this celebration or this commemoration. And I think it's also important to make a distinction between the different types of ecstatic national events and to think about the styles of media reporting that may be associated with each. So in terms of a commemoration or a funeral, we might have much more respectful, awed commentary, much more formal. The BBC, for example, has thought very carefully about how it's going to mark the death of Queen Elizabeth II and what forms of appropriate language can be used and the styles of commentary that can be employed. Other ecstatic national events use very different types of commentary. So for national holiday, the language used, the ideas used, the style of presenting be much more informal, much more jokey, much more entertaining. And finally, I think it's also important to note that where nations take part in competitions that might be regional competitions or global competitions, we often get an interesting style of reporting involving what might be called a them and us style of language. So there's been some interesting research done around the Olympics, looking at how different media organizations, in this case in Andrew Billings' work, looking at how media organizations in China and the United States report the same event. And you won't be surprised to learn that the American media institutions reported it from an American perspective, celebrating when Americans win medals, and when the Chinese media institutions report their focus on Chinese athletes and Chinese success. Both of these countries address an assumed national audience. And I think you can find that around the globe, is this idea that when these events take place, the audience will be a national audience, and those forms of dialectic language, the arts that we will be addressing a national audience. Quick example, partly because my wife is here and she's from the Netherlands, and I know Cummings are quite well. So this is an example of a celebration. It's the celebration of the Dutch royal family, and each year there's a day set aside, and the king, as it is now, will go and visit a town in the Netherlands, and the state broadcaster will follow his activities and report on this, and all of the media schedules on the state broadcaster will be put to the side, and the focus will be on this celebration. But it's not only a top-down process. What you also see is ordinary people around the country coming out, dressing up in orange, and taking part in particular activities that again are designed to show that they are part of the Dutch nation. And increasingly they are using social media to highlight how they are participating in those activities. So I think it's really important to say, when Dayan Katz were talking about media events, it was very much a top-down process. I think we can also start to think about the ways in which these new digital technologies are used to make it a much more bottom-up. So that's one example of what I'm talking about. And just to reiterate this point about a hybrid media system, this is something that my colleague at Loughborough, Andrew Chadwick, talks about in relation to political communication. How political communication has changed in the last 20 years as a result of the impact of digital technology. And how you need to take into account, when you're studying politics, you need to look at mainstream media, absolutely, but you also need to look at the debates that are happening on digital technologies and social websites and so on. And I want to use that idea of this hybrid media system to argue that we also need to look at the ways in which ordinary people can use their Twitter feeds, their Facebook feeds, their Instagram feeds to participate in these events. The example here I've got is the Olympics, 2012 Olympics in London, and Twitter carried out a lot of research at the time to look at the ways in which people in this country, in Britain, were using Twitter. And they were using it very enthusiastically, and they were celebrating when British athletes won medals, and there was some sentiment analysis carried out, looking at the ways in which emotions were communicated through social media feeds. So I think this is a really important feature of the contemporary media landscape, is this hybrid media system. Another example of this comes from a PhD student, Rowan Chen, who's here. She's presenting tomorrow. She's doing some really, really interesting stuff around China. Most of the research on China and the nation and media focuses on hot outbursts of nationalism. She is focusing on the banal and the ecstatic, and what she's found is that during these kind of ecstatic periods, media use changes not only on mainstream media through a focus on the Spring Gala, which is run by the state, but also that ordinary people's use of social media changes during this period as well. So again, this process, top down from major media institutions, but bottom up through ordinary users using social media feeds to participate in these events. And what I want to argue is that many of these events, not all of them, but many of these events, because of these processes of top-down and bottom-up, because of the involvement of mainstream media alongside ordinary users posting on social media, you start to get what Nick Coolbree has called a compulsory mediated sense. But what he's talking about is it's very difficult to escape the media's narratives at these particular moments. These are the front pages of the national newspapers after Britain had a particularly successful day at the 2012 Olympics. And the regional papers were exactly the same. And in this case, even if you have no interest in the Olympics, even if you identify, you don't identify with the nation, it is very difficult to escape. You have to take up a position in relation to this, and it might be one where you're critical or you're indifferent, but it is very difficult to escape this sort of coverage during these sorts of events. I think a similar argument applies to China in the Spring Gala. You may have no interest in it, but it's everywhere. And it recreates this idea that large numbers of people are participating, are actively involved in these sort of events. And another important feature of these events is I think they're important for individual nations, or many people within individual nations give them a chance to show their allegiance, their sense of belonging to a certain nation. But there's also this link between the particular and the universal, is that these events are important not only in reifying individual nations, but reifying and concretizing the idea that we live in a world of nations. And Sabina has come up with this term, the grammar of nation, that each nation should have national symbols, a national flag, a national anthem, a capital city. It should have sporting teams that participate in regional or global events. And I think this is really significant in putting forward this idea, again, of a world of nations. That it's very difficult to escape from. You may have no interest in, identifying with a particular nation. But this idea of a world of nations is made real and made obvious through these particular events. Whether they may be focusing on one nation or whether they may be involving more than one, they concretize this idea that we live in a world of nations and it's normal to belong to a nation in a world of nations. And if we think about countries that are, they're often labelled in the IR literature as failing states. This is one of the ways in which they can put forward this idea that they are significant on a global level. So in the case here, we've got Afghanistan, this idea that Afghanistan isn't a proper nation, doesn't have the accoutrements of a nation state, well, by participating in this sort of global media event, it can actually be like just any other. And I think sometimes when we're thinking about the importance of the media and the link between media and nation, we forget about this level of the nation-state system and how this is represented through these major events and the role of the media, both the mainstream media but also the digital media, in representing this idea of individual nations within a world of nations that is clearly defined. Just one final example of this. I mean, this comes from quite an old study now. And it's talking about the Olympics. But when you watch the Olympics, you are told about other countries around the world. And you are told significant things about who they are and what they like and what they do. And so these global events help us to get to know other countries around the world who are not like us. And I think that's an important feature of these sort of global events in not only representing individual countries, not only showing people celebrating, for example, individual achievements, but this idea that there are nations in a world. Before I get on to the final part of the session today, which looks at the significance of these events that individuals participated in, and I draw on some insights from social psychology in particular, I just want to pause for breath here and say that I'm not arguing that everyone participates in these events equally, with enthusiasm, and for the same reason. It is an empirical question who is integrated by these events. So in the past, when people have been doing research around sporting events, for example, they focused on gender. And they asked the question, do women participate as much as men? In relation to my own research on Britain, there's been an argument, which is slowly changing, that ethnic minorities were much less willing to participate in these ecstatic national events. I had a PhD student a couple of years ago that did some really interesting work on Malaysia. And Malaysia is interesting because it is a multinational state. And what you find is that when Malaysia has its official national holidays, certain ethnic groups within the nation are much less willing to get involved and to participate because they don't feel as much part of the nation as others. One example comes from Northern Ireland. Again, religion is a major factor in the ways in which these events are engaged with or not. So just to be clear, I am not arguing that everyone takes part in these events equally, but what I do want to argue in the final part of the lecture is that they may be really significant for a number of people, and the media's role in this is absolutely fundamental. So in terms of performing the nation, I think these events, rather than dismissing them as kind of one-off events that don't really matter, because they only happen every so often, but actually they are important in allowing people to perform their national identity, to dress up, to paint their faces, to wave flags, to sing songs. And again, the literature in anthropology in particular talks about the importance of ritual in drawing people together. And of course, many of these rituals are media rituals. We watch television broadcasts if we can't be there. We post online. We read the newspaper the next day. And I think this argument from Barbara Blair, talking about the Norwegian national holiday, is really important. Is that through media representation, what we see is significant numbers of people confirming that there is a nation called Norway, and it matters too. And again, this takes place through the media. Without the media, we don't see these celebrations happening across the country. And social media, again, is becoming important in allowing individuals to represent their participation in and their commitment to these events. And I'm running out of time now, but I am going to show you a clip now because it's quite amusing. Probably could do with a break from it. So here we go. Here's a nice little example. You may have seen it at the time. This is children in a school in Uruguay, and they're watching the World Cup, and Uruguay score a goal in the very last minute of the game. Now you might say, well, that's fine. It's running around and waving flags, and it really matter. But actually then to think about, well, okay, what's the reporting in newspapers going to do the next day? What's the evening news going to say about that in Uruguay? And that's not to say that everyone in Uruguay is getting excited by that World Cup game. But significant numbers are. And significant numbers are waving flags and maybe changing their faces and maybe drinking multiple tears. And it's this idea that there is a nation called Uruguay and it matters. It matters to significant numbers of people. A couple of concepts from social psychology that I also think are quite interesting in relation to this argument about putting forward the idea that there are kind of concrete nations, that these nations exist. Lakens and Stell talk about this idea of movement synchrony. People acting together in concert. Now that might be like those kids running around, waving flags. It might be people at the stadium singing a song. It might be people watching a procession go by. And again, singing songs, waving flags, dressing up in a particular way. But all of the evidence from the literature shows that when people do that, both those participating and those watching feel that they are part of a community. And this idea of entitativity, again coming from the literature in social psychology, I think can be applied quite nicely to some of these events. The perception that a community is an entity, is a physical thing, if you like, often comes from these sorts of events where significant numbers of people are orientating their activities together. These are associated with a whole variety of positive outcomes. And of course the media, in complex, large societies, the media are absolutely fundamental to this process of representing nations as if they were concrete, tangible communities. And also that they are concrete, tangible communities that matter to significant numbers. Not everyone will take part, but there's enough people participating to make it seem as the nation is the going concern. I'm coming to the end. Memory. So again, these events are not only important in terms of people participating, they're saturated with emotions, they make nations and national communities seem as if they are concrete entities, but also people can draw on memories of past events and compare, the national holiday we had 5 years ago with the one that we're having now. And compare the Jubilee that we had 25 years ago with the one that we're going to have next year. And compare the World Cup, where we won it, with the one where we lost in the first round. So this idea that there's a community progressing through time as one is also, I think, tied to some of these matters. Again, this concept of perceived collective continuity is being applied to smaller communities, but I think it also can be usefully applied to the nations as well, alongside Anderson's idea of symbolic immortality. This idea that even though you may die, your national community will carry on. And it seemed to give a sense of comfort to many people around. And these memories, again, are connected to media. Mainstream media, news reporting, live reporting of the event, but also increasingly through digital media. The final argument I want to make, and probably it applies to some countries more than others, is this idea when there are ongoing concerns about who belongs to a particular nation. These events may be really important in allowing some people to celebrate their sense of national belonging, their sense of nationality. So this came from an interview I did a few years now with people in England. And they were talking about the World Cup campaign, and they were talking about the fact that you can see flags being displayed across the country. This is quite unusual. When I was growing up, the flag was a symbol of power. Since about the mid-2000s, people have been displaying flags in England around the World Cup. And I asked them, what's going on here? And they said, we don't know who we are. There's a sense of uncertainty about we need to kind of recreate this idea that there is an English nation and we belong. Now, some of those arguments are problematic. They may involve racist tropes, sexist tropes. But I don't think we can wish them away, and we need to understand what these events mean to people and why they matter to certain groups. And that where national forms of identity and belonging seem to be under threat, it may be that these events that bring people together become increasingly important. So, by way of conclusion, I think rather than dismissing these events as kind of one-off temporary delusion where people come together and wave flags and get pissed, they actually matter, and we need to think about their importance in relation to hot and banal. But they also highlight the role of the media. The role of the media in representing nations as if they were coherent entities, and allowing people to have shared reference points and shared memories and shared performances, and underpinning a sense of community in what is often a quite scary and challenging one. So, my argument today is that the role of the media in these events is important, but we also need to think very carefully about the significance of these events to large numbers of people around the globe. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed for a fascinating paper. Well structured. You could do it without a mic. It says a lot about it says a lot about the focus in this hall, so thank you very much. We have some time for questions.